Welcome to lesson number 6. Today's lesson is all about the grand staff. I thought the last lesson was a pretty big lesson with a lot of new information, and unfortunately this is also going to be a pretty meaty lesson, but I do feel like after you learn about the grand staff, things do come a little bit easier from here on out. So here is a staff. This probably looks a little intimidating, but it's not as bad as you might think. We're still going to be using the same notes as before: quarter notes, half notes, dotted half notes, and whole notes. And this is really just an extension of what you've learned so far. So a staff is just these 5 lines, called staff lines. And where we see notes on this staff will tell us what notes we should be playing. For example, if a quarter note was shown here, this would be this E that's above middle C. And if we showed a note here, it would be this G above middle C. This is just to give you a basic idea of how notes are placed on a staff. But you don't need to memorize all these notes yet. So let's get rid of the notes and just look at the staff again. This squiggly thing over here is called the treble clef. And for now, just take this to mean that what you're looking at should be played with the right hand. Here's the basic right hand C pentascale. We're starting at middle C and going up through G. Notice that these notes can either go on a line, such as these notes, or between lines, like these notes, which we call spaces. Going up or down the white keys, you alternate between having notes on the lines and notes on the spaces. Keep in mind that this is for the white keys only. We'll get to the black keys later. If you look at middle C, you'll notice that it's not actually on or near any of the 5 staff lines, but it is a line note. It actually gets its own small little line, which is called a ledger line. We use ledger lines for these notes that are off the staff to show whether these notes are line notes or space notes. If we did something extreme, like show this note way up here, without ledger lines we'd have no idea what note this was. We don't know if it's a space note or a line note. So we would show as many ledger lines as we needed to get up to that note. Just think of ledger lines as an extension of the staff. So getting back to lines and spaces, when we move from a line note to a space note, or from a space note to a line note, this is called a step. Think of a step as moving from one white key to the next white key up or down the piano. So here's some examples of steps. You can see they all go from a space to a line or a line to a space. If we move from a line note to a line note or a space note to a space note, this is called a skip. And think of a skip as moving from one white key up or down 2 white keys. Here are some examples of skips. You can see these all go from a line note to a line note or from a space note to a space note. Let's get back to the treble clef. Right now there are only 2 notes that I want you to remember. Middle C, which you should know where that is on your piano, and treble G, which is at the top of the C pentascale, so you should know where that is as well. Middle C will always be on the first ledger line below the staff lines. Always. Treble G is always on the second staff line up from the bottom of the staff. If you started at middle C and went up by steps all the way to treble G, you'll see that D, E, and F all fall where you would expect them to be as we move up the staff. But for now, I just want you to remember where middle C is and where treble G is. We'll get to these other notes later. So that's treble clef, which again refers to what your right hand should be playing. But what about your left hand? For that, we'll be using the bass clef. This is just like the staff we were looking at before, but now we're showing the bass clef here instead of the treble clef, which means you'll be playing this with your left hand. The bass clef kind of looks like a backwards C with 2 dots. The basics of the staff that we learned with the treble clef still apply here. Where we see notes on the staff will tell us what notes to play, and These notes alternate between lines and spaces just like before. This note right here is middle C. You see that this is on one ledger line above the top staff line. And you might think, well, wait a second, this looks nothing like middle C and treble clef. Let's look at the treble clef middle C again. Now we have the bass clef middle C. These are the same notes. One is just shown in the treble clef and one is shown in the bass clef. At this point, you're probably a little confused, but just keep watching and you'll see how this all comes together and makes sense. So let's go back to the bass clef. Besides middle C, we're going to look at one more note in the bass clef, and that is bass F. Put your left hand in the F pentascale. Now your pinky's on bass F and your thumb is on middle C. Middle C will always be one ledger line above the bass clef staff, and bass F will always be on the second line down from the top staff line in the bass clef. If we went up from bass F to middle C by steps, you'll see that G, A, and B are exactly where you would expect. For now though, the only notes I want you to remember are bass F and middle C. At this point you might be a little confused and I wouldn't blame you, but let me show you how the treble clef and bass clef come together and it should make more sense. Here we've combined the treble clef and bass clef into what we call the grand staff. Again, the treble clef will typically show it should be played with the right hand, and the bass clef will show it should be played with the left hand. You'll see we have a brace here on the left, which you should recognize, and that means that the treble clef and bass clef are read and played together as a single piece of music from left to right. Now let's put a middle C in the treble clef and a middle C in the bass clef. You can see how they're on the same horizontal ledger line, so you can now see how it makes sense for these to be the same notes. As you move up from middle C, you get further into the treble clef, and as you move down from middle C, you get further into the bass clef. In the last lesson, I mentioned that middle C was special, and this is why. It separates the piano into the treble, which is generally considered everything above middle C, and the bass, which we would consider everything below middle C. So the way I showed you this staff had middle C being on the same line, regardless of if it was in the treble clef or the bass clef. The reality is a little bit different. It can be shown like this, but usually the staves are separated more than this, so middle C in the bass clef does not show up on the same line as middle C in the treble clef. It should always be obvious whether a note is in the bass staff or the treble staff. You just need to pay attention to what staff you're looking at. Just remember that middle C will always be one ledger line above the bass staff and one ledger line below the treble staff. So in the treble clef, I said I wanted you to remember these two notes, middle C and treble G. I'm going to call these reference notes, because if you can remember these two notes, you can figure out a lot of the notes around them. For example, if I asked you what note this was, you could start with middle C and see that this is one step up above it, which would be D. Or if I asked what note this was, you can see that it's one step below treble G, which would be F. This note is one step above treble G, which would be A, and so on. Similarly, we can do the same thing with the bass clef. So I wanted you to remember bass F and middle C. So if I asked what note this is, you would see that it's one step above bass F, which would be G. This note is one step above middle C, which would be D. This note is two steps above, or one skip above bass F, which would be A. Or you could say this is two steps below, or one skip down below middle C. Gradually, you'll learn to identify all these notes on the grand staff without even having to think about it. But for now, we can use these four reference notes to identify the other notes around them. So again, in treble clef, middle C is always one ledger line below the staff lines. Treble G is always on the second staff line from the bottom. In bass clef, middle C is always one ledger line above the staff lines, and bass F is always on the second staff line from the top. For this week's exercises, these are the only 4 notes you're going to have to use and remember. If you're having trouble remembering where treble G and bass F are, here's a small trick that can help you remember. Another name for the treble clef is the G Clef. Take a look at this circular part of the treble clef. Notice how there's kind of a crosshair in this circle that aims at the second staff line, which is G. So you could say that the treble clef actually rests on the G staff line. So if you can remember that this is called the G Clef and look for these crosshairs, this can help you remember that the note G will be on this line. Another name for the bass clef is the F Clef. If you take a look at these 2 dots on the right side of the clef, in between these 2 dots is the F line on the staff, so you could say that the bass clef rests on the F staff line. So this is just another visual reminder if you forget where bass F is on the staff. Before we close things out, let's do one quick exercise that will be similar to what you'll see in this lesson's worksheet. Remember that when 2 notes are to be played together, the note heads will share a stem, like this. You can also see that we have measures and measure lines, and each measure has 4 beats in this example. So really, even with the introduction of the grand staff, this isn't that different from the exercises we were doing in previous lessons. What I could show you is the finger number layout, like I always have, but since we have the grand staff now, we don't really need this. We don't need this anymore because we know that in this case all notes here are going to be middle C, all notes here will be treble G, in the bass all notes here will be middle C, and all notes here will be bass F. You'll also see that we have a repeat here, and notice how we have 2 repeat dots on each staff. Those little wings on the top and bottom that are kind of attached to the double bar line aren't anything important. That's just how my notation software shows repeats. So don't worry about those. The important thing here are the dots. So now, instead of showing you the finger layouts for each exercise, now what we'll do is we'll give you some cues to help with fingering. So in this case, I will say 1 on blank, and you should be able to fill in the blank with C. In the left hand, I'll have 5 on blank, which you know to be bass F. So this is how this would sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it for this lesson. This was another big lesson, so if some of these concepts aren't quite clear, don't be afraid to watch it a second time. I will say that I feel like what you've learned up to this point is some of the more difficult information to wrap your head around, so if you've been able to keep up with everything, congrats on making it this far. Be sure to do the worksheet. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. See you next time.